Well, in another major development tonight, Buckingham Palace has said that the King has made clear his profound concern at allegations about the conduct of his brother, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor.
Andrew lied to the world. When he sat down for that BBC interview and claimed he couldn't have been at the party with a teenager because he was at a Pizza Express in Woking.
I've never really felt the need to go and party, and certainly going to Jeffrey's was not about partying. Absolutely not.
It sounded too pathetic to even be a lie. For a second, people were genuinely confused. But then the locals started talking, and the boring town suddenly became the center of a global mess. Did that pizza story actually protect him? Or was it the exact moment his entire life began to fall apart? Join us as we go through the lies, the contradictions, and the local voices that might finally end the Epstein scandal. The interview that broke the internet. On November 16, 2019, Prince Andrew sat down with Emily Maitlis for a BBC Newsnight interview that his advisors actually thought would be a smart move. They reportedly believed this was going to be a controlled and dignified way to shut down all the talk about his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. What actually happened was a complete train wreck that nobody who watched it will ever be able to forget. Within hours of the broadcast, the footage was being played on every major news channel across the planet. This wasn't because the case being made was strong or even believable. It was because the claims being tossed out were so absolutely baffling that the world couldn't look away from the disaster. Virginia Giuffre, who had been one of Epstein's most prominent accusers,
Britain's royal family bracing for the fallout over that first UK interview with a woman who says that she was directed to have sex with Prince Andrew.
Alleged that on the night of August 10, 2001, she was taken to Tramp nightclub in London by Andrew, that he danced with her and sweated on her, and that she was then sold to Ghislaine Maxwell's nearby townhouse, where she was forced to have intimate relations with him against her will. She was 17 years old at the time. Andrew denied every part of it. And then he explained where he actually was that night. He was, he said, at a Pizza Express in Woking, at a children's birthday party for Princess Beatrice. The internet immediately split into two groups, the people who were horrified and the people who couldn't stop laughing. It wasn't that the actual crimes were funny, but the alibi was so incredibly boring and weirdly specific that it felt like a bad comedy sketch. Someone said it felt like the prince was trying to use a family pizza night in Surrey as a getaway card. People went wild with memes and flooded the Pizza Express Woking page with fake reviews. One person even joked that the dough balls were so life-changing they would remember them for decades. The restaurant actually saw a spike in bookings because apparently nothing sells pizza like a high-profile legal disaster. But behind all of that noise, something was building, because journalists were already calling people in Woking, and the locals had things to say that Andrew's team had not prepared for. What Woking actually remembered. The basic rule of any alibi is that it actually needs someone to back it up. That is the absolute bare minimum for a defense to even function. A person claims they were in a specific spot, they produce some shred of evidence, and everyone either buys the story or they don't. The problem with this specific pizza story was that absolutely nobody in the entire town of Woking actually remembered it happening. Not a single staff member, not the regular customers, and not even the neighbors who lived right next to that Pizza Express in the summer of 2001. Not one person came forward after that massive TV interview to confirm they saw a royal sitting there that night. It is almost impressive to be a literal prince and still manage to be less memorable to the public than a side of cheap garlic bread. Multiple former employees of the Woking branch spoke anonymously to British journalists in the days following the Newsnight broadcast. The general theme of what they said was consistent. A royal visit was not a small thing. A prince walking into a Pizza Express on a high street in a town the size of Woking would have meant security, probably a brief staff alert, and a story that people would have told at every Christmas party for years afterward. One former worker allegedly told a tabloid that nothing like that had ever happened on any shift they could remember, and that if it had, everybody would have known about it. Local residents who had been living near the restaurant in 2001 gave similar accounts to reporters. One woman allegedly told a journalist that the town was close-knit enough in those years that a royal visit anywhere near the high street would have circulated as neighborhood gossip within hours. She said she had heard nothing then and had no memory now of anything unusual happening that summer. Others pointed out that August was a relatively quiet month in the area, which would have made an unusual event even more noticeable, not less. What really made the situation a disaster for Andrew was the specific way the story was framed. This was not a vague claim about maybe being in Woking on a random night. Instead, the account was presented as a perfectly clear memory. It was described as a trip that stuck in the mind precisely because it was such an unusual thing for a royal to do. That kind of overconfident speech basically invited the entire world to double-check the details. When people actually started looking for proof, they found absolutely nothing to back it up. No booking records ever surfaced to show a table was reserved. Not a single staff member stepped forward to confirm the story. There were no dated photos from other customers, no grainy CCTV footage, and not even a single crumpled-up receipt. It was just one man's isolated memory that, according to everyone living and working near that restaurant at the time, simply did not happen. Pizza Express keeps actual records. Restaurants have CCTV cameras. Staff tend to remember unusual events, especially when royalty walks through the door. If this alibi were true, it should have been the easiest thing in the world to confirm. A booking log, a dated photo, or even one former server willing to go on the record would have done it. Instead, absolutely nothing appeared. The palace couldn't produce a single verifiable fact, and the silence from Woking filled every gap where the evidence should have been. That silence was its own kind of answer. But by then, journalists were no longer just asking about one evening in Surrey. They were asking about everything. The Epstein shadow. The reason why the pizza story failed so badly is because of the massive disaster it was trying to cover up. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't just some random creep. He was the middle of a giant web of power, cash, and abuse that reached across the globe and sucked in some of the most famous men alive. He had a private island in the Virgin Islands that his victims described as a literal house of horrors. He also had a massive Manhattan townhouse where he allegedly threw parties for politicians, famous professors, royals, and billionaires. When your name is linked to a guy like that, claiming you were busy eating a pepperoni pizza in a quiet suburb doesn't exactly clear the air. The guy had a private jet with a flight log that looked like a VIP list for the Western elite. Andrew hadn't just met Epstein once. He had known the man for years and stayed at several of his properties. There was even that infamous photo of the two of them in Central Park in 2010, which was taken 2 years after Epstein had already been convicted on charges involving a minor. That single image had already trashed Andrew's reputation long before the Newsnight interview even aired. The palace had already tried to play it off by admitting the 2010 meeting was a massive mistake. The entire point of the televised interview was to finally move past the scandal, but it ended up doing the exact opposite. Virginia Giuffre's legal team claimed she passed multiple polygraph tests administered by professional examiners, which is a fairly high bar for a story that has been picked up by every major news outlet on the planet. She also managed to keep her account incredibly consistent for years, across a massive number of interviews. She provided specific details on 3 separate occasions where she was allegedly forced to have intimate relations with Andrew, including dates, exact locations, and potential witnesses. Crucially, she gave this entire statement to law enforcement investigators long before the story ever turned into a global media circus. Andrew's defense against these heavy allegations was that she must have been confusing him with someone else, that he had a bizarre medical condition that physically prevented him from sweating, and that he was busy eating at a Pizza Express in Woking. Former Epstein associates, speaking to American investigative journalists after Epstein's death in August 2019, allegedly described a social culture around the financier, where powerful men were protected not by any formal arrangement, but simply by the network itself. The assumption, according to these sources, was that wealth and status meant consequences did not apply. One source allegedly told an investigative outlet that records existed that could place Andrew in locations inconsistent with several of his stated whereabouts, not only on the night Jeffrey described. Those records never surfaced in public, but the allegation added weight to a story that was already moving fast: the arrest in the town that never believed him. On February 19, 2026, the cops finally dragged Andrew Mountbatten Windsor in. This arrest had nothing to do with the old scandals everyone is sick of hearing about. New dirt from the Epstein files suggested Andrew was handing over secret government intel like it was a party favor. The police spent 11 hours digging through his houses and grilling his former bodyguards to see what else had been swept under the rug over the years. By the time he actually left the police station, photos showed him looking like a total disaster in the back of a Range Rover. Getting interrogated for half a day is certainly one way to spend a birthday. The real story is not about the national headlines, but what went down in Woking, Surrey. For the locals there, the drama did not just appear out of nowhere in 2026. This mess started years ago inside a random pizza place, where they all remembered the cringeworthy TV interview and the quotes that became internet jokes. But the actual weirdness is in what the residents have been saying the entire time. People in Woking have been gossiping about this for long before the police finally bothered to show up and make the arrest. The drama was far deeper than just a shaky alibi that sounded a bit unlikely to the average person. The pushback from the local community in Woking was intense and specifically detailed. It is essentially like someone claiming to have been at a very specific McDonald's on a random Tuesday, only for every single employee, regular customer, and neighbor to point out that the story makes zero sense given how the business actually functions. That is the exact level of resistance that came from the people living in that town. The argument was not merely that the story felt difficult to believe or a bit far-fetched. The locals were saying the entire scenario was basically impossible, and they have maintained that exact same stance for years without ever changing the details. Residents who actually frequent that Pizza Express pointed out that a member of the royal family showing up would have been the biggest event in the history of that street, yet nobody saw a thing. The collective memory of an entire town stands in direct opposition to a single, very convenient claim made in a television studio. There is also a family member caught in the middle of all this who reportedly broke down in tears after watching that interview live, completely blindsided by what they were seeing. And then there is the bigger picture, the central figure in all of this who never lived to see how far these revelations would eventually go. We are going to get into all of it. But if that moment lit the fuse, what came next turned a quiet town into a permanent headline. And the real question is, how did one interview manage to reshape reputations, memories, and an entire community overnight? The story is still not over. Andrew had been living in Royal Lodge, a 30-room mansion on the Windsor estate, since 2003. That is 30 rooms for one guy. When King Charles finally told him to leave, Andrew apparently fought back, using the "but I'm your brother" card to try and stay put. It didn't work. By October 2025, Charles made the move final.
We have some breaking news this morning. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor has been kicked out of the Royal Lodge by his brother, the King.
By February 2026, Andrew had shifted into Wood Farm, a cottage on the Sandringham estate that a former royal butler once called humble. His permanent spot, Marsh Farm, is still being renovated. So just to be clear, the guy went from a 30-room Windsor palace to a basic cottage. That one sentence basically sums up his entire decade. Now here is the part of this story that genuinely stops people in their tracks. Virginia Giuffre, the woman who brought these allegations forward in the first place, is not alive to see any of this happening. She passed away last year after years of public scrutiny, legal battles, and people trying to tear her credibility apart at every turn. Her brother Sky Roberts spoke to reporters after the arrest and said the family was grateful that police had finally taken meaningful action after a very long wait. That quote hits differently when you think about everything she went through to get to this point. And the story is still moving. In the days right after the arrest, lawmakers in the United Kingdom voted to approve the release of confidential documents linked to Andrew's connections to Jeffrey Epstein. Peter Mandelson, the former British ambassador to Washington, was also arrested in the same investigation and later released on bail. So this is not wrapping up neatly. The full picture of what is being uncovered is still coming together, and nobody knows yet exactly how wide this goes. But here is the thing. This was never really about a pizza restaurant. That restaurant, that interview, that smiling delivery of one very unusual quote, they all became symbols of something much bigger. A man who thought one casual alibi would close the conversation permanently. What the entire saga actually shows, when you look at it from start to finish, is a consistent pattern of arrogance. The kind where someone genuinely believes the rules everyone else lives by simply do not apply to them. And that belief, more than anything else, is what has driven every single chapter of this story. But what looks like a simple story about one strange alibi is really about something much deeper. And when you step back and look at everything, you have to ask, was this ever really about the pizza, or about the choices that followed? The lawsuit and the settlement. In August 2021, Virginia Giuffre filed a civil lawsuit against Prince Andrew in a New York federal court. The lawsuit alleged that Andrew had taken advantage of her when she was a minor at 3 locations connected to Jeffrey Epstein. Andrew's legal team argued that a 2009 settlement agreement between Giuffre and Epstein contained language broad enough to release third parties from related claims, and that the lawsuit should therefore be dismissed before it reached trial. In January 2022, a federal judge rejected that argument and ruled the case could proceed. It was a significant defeat. The prospect of a full civil trial in New York meant discovery. It meant documents. It meant depositions. It meant witnesses. It meant Virginia Giuffre sitting across a table from Andrew's lawyers answering questions about what she alleged had happened. And it meant Andrew potentially having to do the same. Multiple legal analysts covering the case said the discovery process alone would likely produce disclosures that neither Andrew nor the palace wanted aired in open court. Reports in American media, citing sources close to the proceedings, alleged that the legal team's concern was not only about the specific claims, but also about what a wide-ranging discovery process might uncover about Andrew's broader associations with Epstein's network. In February 2022, it was announced that Andrew and Giuffre had reached an out-of-court settlement. The financial terms were not disclosed publicly. Reports in major American and British outlets, citing sources with knowledge of the negotiations, suggested the total figure involved ran to several $1 million and included a donation to Giuffre's charitable foundation supporting victims of modern slavery. Multiple credible reports indicated that Queen Elizabeth II contributed to the settlement from her personal funds, a detail that underlined how seriously the palace viewed the threat of what a trial could produce. Andrew's statement finally admitted that Giuffre had suffered as a victim, but it stopped way short of actually admitting to any wrongdoing. Her legal team claimed she could finally move forward, but critics were quick to point out that the massive settlement meant the evidence was never actually tested in a real court. The public never got the clear answers that the ridiculous pizza alibi had supposedly promised to provide. All those specific questions raised by the locals in Woking were never formally addressed or debunked. They just drifted into the background of a story that moved on without ever reaching a real resolution. Did Prince Andrew actually visit that Pizza Express in Woking? And who really paid the price for Andrew's choices? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.